Okay, you asked an impossible set of questions, which I put here to remind you that you're impossible. How do we make sure locally produced food is available, that we use waste food well and food grown locally? Well, my answer is this, the first line, with very great difficulty. It's because almost everything is going in the other direction from what you're suggesting, as usual. And at the end of my slides, I put a national poll, which shows that you're absolutely in line with what majority thinking thinks it wants from food. But they say they want local and then don't do it. They say they don't want to waste and then waste, and so on. So there's an enormous gap between what we think we want and what we actually do. And I'm one too. And the reason is that your demand requires impossible and very systemic change. There's no simple thing to be able to address that nirvana that you want. Over the last 10, 20, 50 years, 70 years, supply chains have lengthened, waste has become intrinsic to the system. And consumer connections to food are now totally distant. And Britain is particularly interesting in this, without going into Brexit. If you think about Brexit, the whole issue of food barely came up, yet if there was one issue that really needed to be debated about Europe, it was Europe and food, because Europe feeds us, basically. Britain has a declining production, was a bit produced, but according to how you calculate it, I'll show you that in a moment. And part of that is not to blame us as consumers, or indeed producers or farmers. And I should say that I was a farmer once, although I'm an academic now. It's because policy frameworks basically don't help us. They're delivering what they were asked to do 70 years ago, whether we're in the European Union or not, which was just to produce more food, make it cheaper. And that's what's happened. And that's the mess that we're in. And I've put 7 points that I think need cut across the answer to your 3 really good questions. The first is the British don't want to pay the growers and the fisher folk more. And this is a complicated slide. I've done slides, you can have them later. These are the government's official figures. That chart on the left is the entire British food system. We, the consumers, are up there, I've ringed it, that's all of us, 66 million people. If you were to go down to about the middle of the bottom and see how much money farmers get out of the £250 billion that we spend on food in Britain, and food and soft drinks actually, farming gets about £10 billion. Farming gets about 4 or 5% of the gross value added. It's tiny. And if on the right in blue, I've put the figures of where the money goes. Basically, the money goes off the land to near where the majority of the consumers live. So if you want to have shorter chains, you want more local production, you're going to have to pay more to the growers and primary producers. And on the left here, the second message is consumers have got to be prepared to spend more if they want to have change. And that's because basically, if you look at that, the figure on the left, and I've ringed food there, you'll see in the light blue, that's how much money we spent in Britain in 1957 on food. It was nearly 1/3 of our domestic incomes. It's gone down to about 15%. Actually, that includes eating out. Arguably, it's much less than that now, but if you include it. So in other words, we're getting more food, we're eating out, we're going all over the place, and we're not giving it to the primary producers. The third thing we must do is we've got to get a grip of what we mean by eating well. Britain is the most ultra-processed diet of Europe. It's in pink here. This is a very big study done by mates of mine in Brazil and elsewhere, looking at the European Union and the countries that have good data, which we're one. And basically, Britain, nearly 51% of the British diet is ultra-processed food. So factory food, high in salt, sugars, and fats, pre-processed, not made from primary produce, but turned into food that looks like food but is fatty, salty, and sugary. And then we have a very major problem of obesity and overweight. And if you notice, if nothing else from COVID-19, the single biggest factor, other than getting the virus, that affects your life expectancy in it, is whether you're obese or not. And Britain is an obese society. We waddle, we don't walk. And here's why: portion sizes have got bigger, the commodities are cheap, imported, and you can see, you can look at this later, a very interesting study, just because I've used this because it's got good visuals. Everything's got bigger. Packets, muffins, sizes of what you get when you get some coffee, a pizza when you go out, everything's got enormous. How many crisps you get in your crisp packet, everything's got bigger. And we know the data. Paul comes third after me, I think, knows this only too well. This is from a study I was the lead on policy on, a very famous now study, came out last year called the Lancet Report, which basically looked at the globe. Forget Britain for a moment. The food system is driving the world's climate change, water use, biodiversity loss, waste, you name it. Food is heavily implicated. And if we really wanted to do it and sort it out and give people a healthy diet, you have to do what these arrows I've put at the bottom are. You don't need to increase cereal production by 2050 to deliver health and feed the world well without damaging ecosystems, but you've got to increase vegetables by 75%, fruits by 50%, cut red meat. Here you are in Kendal, surrounded by herd sheep. We need less cattle and sheep and more fruit and vegetables. Pretty hard in Kendal. I know it pretty well. I used to farm in the forest of Bowland, not far away, same sort of climate. Got to increase fish somehow. That's very problematic. The seas are a total mess. Increase legumes, increase seeds and nuts. That's a global picture. Now, no one's saying that's what Britain's got to do, but the broad picture is the same in most countries. We've got to eat more fruit and vegetables. That means more horticulture. So if you in Kendal want to have a low carbon diet and be healthy, you're going to have more horticulture around Kendal. Now, do you want that in plastic greenhouses or what? How are we going to measure that? You can have local strawberries, but it'll be using lots of energy input when you can get it on a truck from Spain in the midwinter, much lower carbon. The answer is you have to change culture and only have strawberries for maybe 5 weeks in the year, not 10 weeks, 10 months in the year. So this is a cultural challenge, very big deal. And here in one slide is what the Lancet report came up with. You can look at this later. Basically meat, if you look at the list on the left, going down the page, these are all per serving of ruminant meat, pork, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs, whatever, and cereals and fruit at the bottom. If you work across that table, the calculations are that essentially meat is heavy user of land use, emitter of greenhouse gases, energy use, acidification and eutrophication and so on. And the more you get to a plant-based diet, the lower the impacts go. It's not, yeah, it's not altogether like that, but broadly that's the picture. And here in one slide is what happens in Britain. If you want to have a low impact diet, you can cut down on phosphorus, nitrogen, freshwater use. We're awash with water in Britain. Kendal gets floods and so on. I know that, but we've got to manage our water better. And that's really what the Lake District ought to be doing, is managing its water better, having more trees, sequestering carbon. And the cattle and the sheep can be useful in that, but not as we're doing it at the moment. And basically, Britain's producing less. We're dependent upon others. We're still a post-imperial country. We think others should feed us. We import it. And we still haven't got guidance. As I know, my colleague from the NFU will know, I talk with them all the time. There's great concern about the lack of understanding of where we need to be with only 3 months to go before Brexit land takes off. Fifthly, we've got to take more control of what we eat, whether we eat out, eat in, the best way to get control over your diet is to take the ingredients and cook it yourself. Then you know what's in it. We've got to reduce that waste. Waste is now mostly at the consumer end, and that waste is forced on us by the overproduction and overburdening and oversupply and price signals. That's very tricky. We can come back to that if you want. And the seventh and final point is a very tricky one as well. We've got to accept less choice in our diets. That's a big cultural shift. And at the bottom, I've put some of the figures. I mean, Coca-Cola, the biggest food and drink company in the world, spends twice as much money advertising its products, which are pretty weak in health terms, as the entire budget of the World Health Organization. Do you want me to repeat that? One company, Coca-Cola, spends twice as much advertising its not particularly desirable products for health terms as the entire budget of the World Health Organization for the world. And that's just a symbol. I'm not blaming Coca-Cola of it. I'm just saying the mismatch of health, ecosystems, climate, production and consumption is immense, immense. That's the opinion poll I said I'd mentioned at the beginning. You can look at that later. But basically, to go back to the beginning, where is it? My beginning slide. You can see why I said, no, I can't find it. You can see why I said, there it is. I think you're setting a really good challenge. It's fabulous. I'm with you all the way. But we must not beat ourselves up if it's hard to do. Just to have some local sausages, great. But is that really a local diet, or is it low carbon, or is it healthy? Not necessarily. That's it.